freedom, democracy, equality, the word that everybody used 2,500 years ago, and the rule of law. So when we lawyers talk about the rule of law, we're not like politicians trotting out the phrase as if it's a part of our political jargon. This is a phrase that's built into the law of the European Union. And in the preamble, the member states, I emphasise, confirm their attachment to these great principles: liberty, democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. Now, who could disagree with those values? Well, I read in the Wall Street Journal on the 12th of July, was that 2 days ago, an article by Mr. Kyriakides, I think I pronounced that correctly, who's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. This is a leading think tank in Washington, D.C. And I think he is of Turkish origin. But anyway, this is what Mr. Kyriakides says. US President Barack Obama last week partly blamed the European Union for supposedly driving Turkey away from the West by stalling the country's EU accession. Mr. Obama is confusing cause and effect. The real problem is that the ruralist Islamist Justice and Development Party in Ankara doesn't share the dream of a liberal Western Turkey. That's an allegation. I offer no comment, other than to say that the author of this piece in the Wall Street Journal acknowledges that he has always supported Ankara's EU membership bid. But he adds it's time to admit that the reason Turkey will not join the European Union anytime soon is not because of European reservations towards a Muslim country, but because of the Turkish government's reservations towards European values. So Turkey, if this assessment is correct, Turkey is hesitant about, or has reservations about, embracing European values. What are they? I quote Article 2 of the European Union Treaty. The values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. And the European Union Treaty goes on to say that these values, which Turkey is reluctant to accept, are common to the member states in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. That's a rather sombre assessment, isn't it? Because we want Turkey to become Western, European, and democratic. We need Turkey to embrace human rights. But if it doesn't accept those values, then it should have no place in the European Union. The tragedy for the Republic and for its refugees, and indeed for all citizens of the Republic, irrespective of their racial or religious background, the tragedy for those citizens is Turkey's next door. And if it's going increasingly in an Islamist, non-democratic direction, everybody will suffer. So Cyprus is caught in a dreadful dilemma. Why do ethics matter? I'm conscious that the time is crawling along. Why should ethics matter? Let me just give you that observation from Chief Justice, the late Chief Justice Earl Warren of the United States once again, in full. In civilized life, law floats in a sea of ethics. Each is indispensable to civilization. Without law, we should be at the mercy of the least scrupulous. But without ethics, law could not exist. We forget that, don't we? We lawyers, even us lawyers, we just tend to focus on the law and what's written down, and we forget that there is an ethical backdrop to the law. Now, what is ethics? Well, ethics is an anglicised version of a Greek word. It was the ancient Greeks who developed the notion in the works primarily of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle developed a whole book, or devoted a whole book to the subject, and that book, Ethics, has exercised a profound influence upon the development of European civilization, and indeed the Western liberal tradition. And regrettably, we know that the Renaissance and the Enlightenment largely bypassed the Eastern Mediterranean, which helps explain the militaristic, authoritarian character of the modern Turkish state. And that authoritarianism, I regret to say, feeds into the discourse in the Cyprus question, as I'm going to illustrate a little bit later on. Now, what does Aristotle say about ethics? Well, essentially, I'm summarising here, we're going to have a whole philosophical lecture on this, but I'll encapsulate it in a sentence. Ethics involves the searching for something that is good. And of course, Aristotle in his book asks, well, that begs the question, what is good? But in the context of the European Union, I would suggest the good is encapsulated in those concepts and values I referred to earlier. Respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. In other words, values which were missing in 1974. So let's look at the three guaranteeing powers and their conduct in 1974. Greece was governed by an American-backed military junta, and the junta had no ethical qualms about instigating an unconstitutional and unethical military coup on the 15th of July. Perhaps it was no coincidence that at the time of the coup in Nicosia, the Americans were led by President Richard Nixon, who was embroiled in the Watergate scandal, and he resigned a few weeks later. I think it was on the 8th of August. Nixon had no ethics, even though he was a lawyer by profession. He engaged in a cover-up over the Watergate scandal. And it's no coincidence that the resignation of Richard Nixon eventually paved the way towards the American Ethics in Government Act 1978, an acknowledgement that Nixon had no ethics. And as for the US Secretary of State, Dr. Kissinger, he was an apostle of the realist school of international relations, which goes back to Thucydides, incidentally. But he downplayed, didn't eliminate, but he downplayed and still downplays the significance of ethics and morality on the international stage. Turkey. Did Turkey have any ethics in 1974? Well, as I see it, they had no ethical qualms about using the coup as a pretext to achieving long-held strategic goals. Back in 1974, Turkey seemed to have given no thought to the ethical, let alone legal, implications of engaging in the type of conduct carried out by Hitler's Germany prior to and during the Second World War. What did Hitler do? Well, he snatched the sovereign territory of other states, bombed civilians, uprooted human beings from their homes, and deprived them not only of their property, but their right to property. He also violated their human rights. And it was as a consequence of the Second World War, ladies and gentlemen, that these great instruments of international law sprung up in the late 1940s. The UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, the European Convention of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention. They all sprang up in the late 40s thanks to a Labour government, not Blair and Brown's Labour government, which wrecked the country, but the Attlee government.